Welcome, welcome, welcome to our August 2022 Power Hour with Dr. Leslie Carr. I'm Dr. Caroline Heldman, the Executive Director of the Representation Project. We are an intersectional gender justice organization, and we are fighting sexism any and every which way we can. Today, we are addressing a very important topic: tackling mental health issues or maintaining your mental health when your rights are under attack. It's important to note that women have never held equal value in a patriarchy, so it's not as though we've always had full rights and value. It's also very important to note that marginalized women and otherwise marginalized people, this is not new, right? So women have and people have often been marginalized based on race, ethnicity, skin tone, caste, class, body size, age, sexuality, ability. So we're not just talking about one form of oppression here. We're talking about the intersections of many forms of oppression. And it's not like we just woke up and said, oh my goodness, our rights are being rolled back for the first time. That's not the way this works. So we're going to be properly complex in our analysis here. I will say, though, that we are united as women and people who can get pregnant in the most recent assault on our ability to choose our reproduction and to control our bodies. So with that context, I want to read Dr. Leslie Carr's bio. She is a clinical psychologist and an expert in how trauma, stress, culture, and digital technology can affect your mind. Dr. Carr is on the board of a nonprofit called One Green Thing. This is an organization that is working to address eco-anxiety and the feelings that many people are having about the environment, and particularly young people or Gen Z. Dr. Carr is also consulting on a documentary film that's in development called The Deadline, which is addressing the political polarization and how we're going to need to come together or not to solve the climate crisis. She joins us today to talk about coping strategies during an era where women's rights are systematically being rolled back. And I want to start by just reading the tagline. Dr. Carr, Leslie, if I can call you Leslie, I want to read the tagline of Business Week, just their cover story for today. Abortion rights are under attack, pandemic burnout at work and home, politicians who don't care. After a series of seemingly nonstop societal attacks against American women, we've hit a breaking point, and I really want to just take a moment to share the cover story, because I think a lot of people can relate to this. I don't know how many of y'all are looking at this. The breaking point, right? American women have helped the country achieve 50 years of prosperity, and now, of course, the undoing of Roe. So let's jump right into this. Leslie, as you know, we're experiencing so much right now. What can you tell us about the mental health challenges that we're facing today and how they might be different from what we faced in the past?
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, Caroline, I just want to say I'm honored and thrilled to be here. So thank you so much for having me. And I'm going to start by saying something that at first might sound a little bit like I'm stating the obvious, but I'm going to pivot really quickly to something that I think everyone needs to hear, and it's really important. So over the course of the past couple of years, there are a couple of things in the world of mental health that are sadly on the rise. People are feeling more depressed, they're feeling more anxious, they're struggling with their sleep more, they're struggling with insomnia. And also, the rates of antidepressant and anxiety medication prescriptions have shot through the roof over the course of the past couple of years. They rose 20% in the month of 2020 alone, which probably is not surprising to a lot of people, sadly. But I want people to really notice the language that I'm using. I'm talking about feeling depressed. I'm talking about feeling anxious. I'm talking about struggling with sleep, struggling with insomnia. I am deliberately not using things like, clinical depression, anxiety disorders. And the reason why is because, and this is, gets us into a whole different subject matter that we could go on an absolute wild ride here, but we live in a world that tends to pathologize our mental health experiences. In this culture, particularly, they tend to be medicalized. It's like the notion of being clinically depressed versus feeling depressed. Certainly, some people struggle enough that it becomes clinical depression, but I think the thing that I want to acknowledge today is that it is entirely normal to feel anxious, to feel depressed, to be struggling with your stress levels or your sleep right now. And that is generally true. That is generally true in life. We feel depressed, we feel anxious because things in life are difficult. It just happens to be the case right now that things are really, really difficult. You know, for those of us who have been on the planet for a bunch of decades, there are a lot of people who are having the subjective experience that things are collectively harder right now than they have ever been before. So I think there's a part of me that just wants to set the table for this conversation by saying, if somebody is listening to this right now, watching this right now, and they are struggling in any way, shape, or form, struggling to get out of bed in the morning, struggling with their functioning, feeling hopeless, feeling a sense of dread about the environment, about their rights being rolled back, there is an irony that exists in the world of our mental health, which is that when we acknowledge it, it alleviates the burden. So if we try to say like, it's fine, I'm okay. You know, it's like the cartoon of the dog with the fire in the background, like everything's fine. Ironically, it makes things harder for us. It makes things worse. It can be harder to get out of bed in the morning when we're pathologizing ourselves for feeling the way that we feel, when we say to ourselves, if I only were stronger, I wouldn't feel like this. It's actually really not true. There's nothing, this is not a matter of human frailty or human weakness. This is a matter of a culture of people who are at their breaking point, to the point of the article that you brought up. And if a person is feeling stressed, depressed, anxious, I just want to say, of course you are. Like, this is hard. This feels hard because it is hard.
So what do we do with that? So let's say I'm waking up in the morning and I'm feeling this very heavy burden from the climate crisis, which is increasingly becoming something we can't ignore or say, well, humans didn't cause, you know, all of the standard delay tactics. So we're feeling that. We're still in a global pandemic. Some will say post-pandemic, wherever you are on that spectrum. We've lost a lot of people, a lot of folks facing long COVID. The rollback of Roe obviously is hitting us like a gut punch, although I will say, you know, red state Kansas voting to support abortion protections means that it's not as clear cut as Roe just being rolled back. But I've got this anxiety. Maybe I'm working from home, have been for the past couple of years, or maybe I'm actually going back to the workforce. And that's scary too. And if I am a woman, I'm most likely carrying a lot of the invisible work, which has been incredibly difficult during the pandemic, maybe some economic stressors from inflation, well, maybe, probably. So all of this is coming down on me, right? What do I do when I get out of bed in the morning? Like, what concrete advice do you have, especially for activists who are in the trenches and people who care so deeply about social justice issues?
There are 3 to 4 things that I want to say to address this. And the notion of the people that are in the trenches, we're going to have to kind of give them a special notice at the end, or a special commentary. But there are a couple of things about sort of, we could almost say like rules of the road for our mental health that are really good to keep in mind at a time like this. One goes back to what I was saying a moment ago, which is just to say that if you can even normalize things for yourself and kind of get off your own back, is kind of how I think of it, you know, to sort of not layer suffering on top of your pain by telling yourself you're weak. That alone can actually go a really long way, and to give yourself some grace. The second thing, and this is really crucial, if I've said it once, I could say it a million times because it's just so true. Human beings are profoundly wired for social connectedness. We are the most social species on the planet, and the quality of our relationships is everything for us. in terms of whether they're healthy relationships, not healthy relationships, and also whether or not we have them, whether or not we use them, right? So something that I think is vitally important to keep in mind with the question that you asked is that reaching out for help as much as you possibly can, trying to support other people as much as you possibly can, is can go so far, because we live in a country, so I'll make a very American comment for a moment. We live in a country that really espouses the strength of our independence and sort of makes us feel in a lot of ways like we ought to be able to do it alone. We should pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. And it's just not how human beings are meant to survive or thrive. We are community-oriented people. So one of the things that was really tough during the deeper stages of the pandemic, what we could call like pandemic seasons 1 and maybe seasons 2, I would say we're in pandemic season 3 right now, was that people were so cut off from their relationships. You know, if all you can get is a phone call, it's better than nothing. But human beings are really designed to exist physically in proximity with one another. So even getting a hug from someone that you trust and care about it releases oxytocin in the brain. It's tremendously beneficial for our nervous systems. So I really want to encourage people to not struggle alone, to reach out for help in any way that looks like. It can texting with your best girlfriend. It can be getting on the phone with somebody to be like, oh, the Supreme Court, you know, whatever it takes. But if you can actually break bread with people, have a meal with someone, get a hug, like that's the best thing that we should be striving for. A couple of other things really quickly. I think it's really important for people to know that an over excess of news and digital technology and doom scrolling and digital saturation is distinctly unhealthy for the brain. So I want to encourage people, and we can kind of come at this from a couple different angles today, but the people that I worry about the most are the doom scrollers, because while there's a lot of bad news in the world, there is also good news. If you're doom scrolling all the time, you're sometimes not getting the good news, and you're also not getting the hugs and not getting the meals in, you know, with your friends if you're constantly on the internet. So I really want to encourage people to just be mindful of their media consumption. And the last thing that I would say is that, and this all goes together, and actually I can even think of a couple more things, but time spent in nature, also super healthy for the brain, and taking positive action where we can, as long as it doesn't overwhelm us, can be really good. So if I were to kind of create a recipe for people, I would say more time with people, more time in nature, less time on the internet, more time taking action, ideally in community or communal settings. You know, if you go to a rally with your female friends, you're getting some of the community elements of being with your people, and just giving yourself and others some grace. If you're having a hard time, if they're having a hard time, the two magic words are, of course you're going through a hard time. Of course I'm going through a hard time. Why don't we give each other a hug and have dinner together?
So lots of hugs.
Lots of hugs. Lots of hugs.
In terms of the positive actions, and you talk about, oh, and Zora's making her appearance.
And I was going to say, hugs from pets, they count.
Oh, it's the best.
She got her cue. She rolled on in here to be
Here
like,
the hugs. Aw.
here are the
Either her
pets.
screaming at behind me or being in the shot. So
Hugs and pets.
what actions? So let's say folks want to take some concrete actions. Do you have some ideas about that? And of course, a lot of the actions might be around media consumption. So where can we go, or what can we do to take actions that might make our lives feel better and manageable?
Yeah, it depends on the specifics of the issue that people are struggling with. But some of the stuff that comes to mind is, so if what is on the forefront of one's mind right now is the rollback of our rights and this rogue Supreme Court, certainly we all need to be as politically active as we can be. From a mental health perspective, and I want to make sure that we go back to the people that are in the trenches because they don't have the ability to just log off, right? So if you are not directly on the front lines of this, you can be a little bit more mindful of your media consumption. If you're in the belly of the beast, you don't really have the ability to turn away because it might be part of your work to be paying attention to some things that sometimes might feel really dark, like, the melting of the polar ice caps. If you are directly working in that space, you don't have the luxury of turning away from it. But I think it benefits all of us to feel like we're taking action. It benefits all of us to know, and this is important because I really believe it to be true, that the positive actions that we take can lead to the positive results that we're looking for, right? A lot of people right now are struggling with hopelessness. Yesterday, what happened in Kansas lets us know that, we are in the middle of a war, but we have battles that we can win here. We won in Kansas. Heather White, the founder and CEO of the nonprofit that I am on the board for, One Green Thing, is a really good example of where some of the stuff applies to climate change, because a lot of what she talks about is that, we hear this really scary news. It's really daunting. And a lot of people can easily be made to feel like it's already over, right? It's too late to make a positive change. But the thing that's interesting is that that's not true. The time is now to be taking positive action, but it is not, the fight is not over here. So, if people want to check out some of the resources for One Green Thing, they can go to onegreenthing.org. Heather has an excellent book on this topic for how you can take specific action in the area of climate change. But we're here to talk about a lot of bad stuff. So some people might not feel like that's the thing they're worried about the most. I think what I would encourage people to do is take action where it feels like you can without throwing your stress level over the roof. Take action with other people as much as humanly possible, and spend as much of that time as you can doing it not online, ideally outdoors. So for example, like if you want to go to a protest with your friends, fantastic. And I'm going to make a quick comment about that in a minute. But so if that's something you want to do, great. If you want to go clean up a beach with your friends to sort of take a positive action around climate change, good thing to do with your buddies. If you don't have a lot of friends, because I know some people might be watching this thinking like, but I'm lacking community, I don't know what to do. There are places where you can volunteer in areas that you're passionate about and then meet new like-minded people. I want to encourage people to do that. But the little added note that I'll leave here is that it's really interesting. Our brains respond to the context of things, and it responds to the context that we give something, right? So if we wake up every morning and we think like, oh, this is so hard, this rogue Supreme Court, dismantling our rights, and I don't know what to do, and it's all so stressful, it's all so heavy. To a certain extent, our nervous systems will respond accordingly. It'll respond with increased levels of cortisol. That's the stuff that will keep us from sleeping at night. But if we flip the script a little bit and we say, I'm going to go to a rally with my friends, I'm going to go to a protest. This is something that we're going to do together. We're going to get together first. We're going to have a meal. We're going to make our signs. We're going to go together. Then your brain, it starts responding to the context cues of that. Like it's actually community building and it's community support. Sort of a funny little thing, but it's actually true.
Great. Okay. So everyone should organize a protest or attend a protest. Ideally, if it's in nature and always with your friends. Yes, I love this. Okay.
Exactly.
We have a plan moving forward. Just to touch upon another point you brought up, what tips do you have for folks who might be addicted to their devices to stop the doom scrolling, to get away from the media?
God, it's such a good question. So, first things first, I think knowledge is power. I think one of the things that could be nice about someone hearing this conversation right now is if it's never occurred to them before that being on their phone too much might be problematic. Well, now you know. But there are some things that we sometimes can do to address digital addiction, like, and depending on kind of how bad the problem can be, I want to encourage people to, first of all, stop basically all push notifications other than maybe text messages. So for example, the people who struggle with this the most are people who have lots of things pushing through on their phones, CNN news alerts, that kind of stuff. Really important to, you can go look at CNN when you want to, better to do that than have it telling you when to pay attention to it, right? So that's one thing. For people that are struggling a little bit more, especially if they really want to commit to changing their patterns and habits, they can take things like Twitter off of their phones. They can grayscale their phones, because a lot of what makes our phones so addictive is all the pretty colors and the things that light up and make us want to click. So there's a setting. I'm actually wouldn't be able to say right now how to do it over the phone, but you can Google it, and in the settings, you can grayscale it all. So it's actually a little less rewarding to pick up your phone and poke around at it. I highly recommend just turning your phone off, turning the sounds off, putting it away whenever you can. So for example, especially if you are with other people, put your phone away. You don't need to be in the presence of others and on your phone at the same time. In most instances, there can sometimes be some exceptions, but a lot of the benefits that we get from being around other people, we really, really get when we're not sitting there looking at our phones. So especially for the Gen Z and Gen Alpha people out there, it's a little tough because they've lived with these devices basically their whole lives. But I want to encourage you to put your phone down, your phones down when you're with other people. And even sometimes just leave it at home. This is like a radical Gen X suggestion. But you know what? I do it all the time. When I go to yoga, luckily it's within walking distance, so I don't have to go very far, but I leave my phone at home, walk to yoga, do yoga, and check the phone when I get home. And even brief breaks from it can be really good, really healthy for us. We just don't need to be attached all the time.
Thank you. Great concrete advice. A question getting back to the mental health concerns. Not all of us face the same levels of oppression, right? And daily experiences of micro, meso, and macro aggressions. Can you talk to us about folks with intersectionally marginalized identities? So for example, like women of color, queer women, so folks who are facing multiple systems of oppression on a daily basis, how might their mental health be more affected right now? And I will say, at the start, I noted this. There are a lot of folks who are like, hey, we haven't had rights. People who look, Black people have been shot by police and vigilantes, and like, this is not new. This is baked into our history and our culture and our policies and our laws, even our Constitution. And so there was some pushback, I think, initially with the rollback of Roe and the way people were talking about this gut punch. It certainly affected, white women in a way that perhaps many of us have not been affected for the last half a century. With that said, again, not to compare injuries, not to get into the oppression Olympics, but really to dig into how this might be affecting folks with multiple marginalized identities at this point in time in terms of mental health.
Yeah, well, I want to start. I have a couple things I want to say, but I want to start by kind of repeating what I said before, but leaning a little further into it, which is just to say that for anyone who's watching, who identifies as being any of those marginalized groups, if it feels like life is harder, that's because it is. And again, there's this irony where it might sound in some ways like I'm saying something that's so basic or so simple, but I think it's really important to take the gaslighting out of it, right? It's like, because when we kind of, it's really important to say what it is, it's like, for anyone who is not a white man, so this actually is true of white women as well, things feel harder for us because they are harder for us. And I think one of the reasons why it's so important to name this for what it is that if you buy into the narrative that you're struggling because you're somehow weak, that's actually part of the oppressive system, right? The notion that somebody is, it reminds me of the idea that women are emotional, or that like Black anger is threatening. It's like things will happen to Black people that understandably make them feel rage. And then part of the curse of what they have to live with is having to stuff it all down because God forbid anybody in the world see it. There's a similar thing that happens to women of any color, where they're made to feel like they're more emotional. We're like the more emotional sex, right? Which is, nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, that is a tool of the patriarchy to suggest that women are somehow more emotional than men. I mean, look at Donald Trump's entire presidency, for example. You know, it's like women are not more emotional than men are. Black people are not angrier than white people are. They should not be put in a position where their anger is made out as if it's somehow more threatening. You know, things happen to Black people that are rage-inducing. Things happen to women that make us want to scream, and then we're left to feel like we're being hysterical. It is a tool of the patriarchy. It is a tool of white supremacy. It is a tool of oppression that we're made to feel like something is wrong with us when we're experiencing the logical end results of the emotional expression of the things that happen to us. So I think sort of step number one in the rebellion is to reclaim our right to have our feelings. It's like, reminds me of the Lindy West. Lindy West has a great quote that I might butcher a little bit, but that like feminism is the expression of collective anger, and they make us prove them right all the time. And so I'm really with you. I don't think we should get sort of into the oppression Olympics. I think people can be marginalized in lots of ways. And any marginalized person is a member of a vulnerable group, and we call them vulnerable for a reason. They are quite literally more vulnerable to having their rights taken away in some fashion, to being physically injured as a result of their race or gender in some fashion, their gender expression. Trans rights are a part of this. You know, people are physically more vulnerable, legally more vulnerable in lots of ways. And newsflash, we all have feelings about it, like very valid feelings about it.
Great. And just to follow up on that, we will be putting resources for various marginalized groups, mental health resources in the chat at the end of this program. And I have one more question for Leslie, and then your question should be pouring in to the Q&A here. It just a quick note too, that marginalized women tend to have a harder time finding mental health resources, right? Whether you're talking about low-income women, whether you're talking about women of color, whether you're talking about LGBTQ plus women, and women with disability. It's really important that we acknowledge that a lot of us are facing intersections of oppression, which make our lives more difficult empirically, in ways that we can measure quantitatively, make our lives more difficult, and
Absolutely.
harder to get resources and support. Did you have something to follow up
on? I just wanted to say amen. I mean, like it is empirically, objectively true.
Yeah, and we get into this back and forth about, you know, the left focusing too much on identity. Well, the moment at which these identities don't matter will be the moment at which I, as a data scientist, stop talking about it. I don't want this data to exist. So let's get to a place where that can happen, but it doesn't happen by acting like it doesn't exist. So focusing in on what, you know, the hope in these trying times, your personal, maybe a little bit about your personal story, however much you want to share, but what is your strategy for maintaining a healthy, vibrant way of being throughout all of this turmoil?
Thank you for asking. I try to walk my talk as much as humanly possible. So I will just share a little bit with everybody about how I put into practice the things that we've talked about today. I try to balance my media consumption and my focus on what's happening in the world, with focusing a little more so, the ratio is maybe we would call 55-45 or 60-40, where I try to limit my news consumption ever so slightly so that my focus is more so on my own life and what's happening right in front of me. I try to nurture my relationships as much as I possibly can. I try to focus on cultivating things in the real world that matter to me. I really enjoy cooking. I enjoy spending time in nature. And I try to not doom scroll, spend too much time on my phone. I try to be very selective about where I get my news from, and what I index for in my news consumption is deliberately seeking out things that I deem to be non-hysterical. So I would rather listen to a really thoughtful podcast about the state of the world and what I can do about it than to, turn on CNN and just let it roll. Like I just try to be mindful about the news that I consume. But it is important to be awake and aware. So I try to, be as informed as I possibly can about what's happening and also what I can do about it. And that's basically it in a nutshell. I try to walk my talk. And if I'm having a bad day, I'm a constitutionally pretty optimistic person, actually. But if I'm having a hard day for some reason, I remember when, the news broke about Roe originally, and like, that was a tough week. It just was and this, there's so many things that we could put into this category, but I'm just remembering that one particularly, where I had a couple of days where I just felt blue about it all. And I just gave myself some grace. It's like, yeah, this sucks, honestly. It's just not like, this is not good. And it's hard to be a person in the world of any kind when you know that there are some people here that view you as inherently inferior. The thing that I couldn't get over that week was like, wait, let me get this straight. I'm not just a second-class citizen. I'm actually a third-class citizen, because in an early pregnancy, in the first trimester of pregnancy, I'm actually less valuable in some people's eyes than a clump of cells in my body. Like, my entire personhood is less valuable than the potential of that life down the road. It's to me, it makes me do a certain kind of mental gymnastics. But I would say that it was kind of like 4 or 5 days of just being in the pits about it all. And then just kind of doing a little bit of doom scrolling, because we all have our moments. And then I just tried to kind of pick myself up and move on from there. But that's what things look like for me.
Okay, well, and to build on that, because I do a lot of media commentary, so I have to constantly be in the mix, right? In the Rep Project, it's nonstop gender justice work, and so I don't have the luxury of disconnecting. I don't know if I could anyway. Let's act like that's not an addiction, but I'm constantly connected, constantly getting the steady stream of negative news. And I'm very much leaning into the anger, to channel Soraya Shamali, who's written Rage Becomes Her, and others who've talked about the importance of women's anger. And I just assume the worst all the time. Maybe since I was like a toddler and I figured out what we were, what meat was. I mean, I've been a little angry, right? In the sense that like the world has a lot of injustice, and we do things that we don't need to do that harm others, right? And it sounds so childlike, but I really find it to be effective to lean into the anger for action, right? So there's always action steps that go with that anger. And I view the anger as a very important tool for me to gauge my moral compass, right? Like what's happening in the world in terms of social justice. And yeah, just constantly angry and working through that through activism. And I don't know how many other people use that same approach, but that's the effective way for me. And I'm super happy and optimistic all the time and hopeful it's going to be better, but I don't assume that. I assume that I have to do a lot of work to get us, to everybody has to do a lot of work, but I have to do work to get me and the world where I want it to be. It's not just going to happen.
Yeah, and we need you for that reason, and we need people like you. I mean, there's something that I just would love to comment on really quickly, which is that I think anger, unfortunately, is an emotion that has been pathologized in our culture. We're often made to feel like there's something wrong with anger, and I think the only time that anger can ever really be bad or destructive is when we kind of seep in it so much that it really starts to negatively impact our mental health. If your entire state of being is sort of seeping in anger all the time, that can be tough. But otherwise, anger can be a very healing emotion, especially when it's channeled in the right direction. And it's also a very mobilizing emotion. There is nothing inherently wrong with anger. And I know in a moment we need to turn it over to the Q&A, but I would love for people to take, if they, take nothing else away from this talk, like to own your feelings, to let them be what they are. It is okay to feel angry. It's when things are happening right now that make us feel angry. And it's, there's an element of it that can be righteous and empowering. And it's, let's use it. Let's use it to our benefit.
There we go. Well, great question. Couple of questions in the Q&A. Let's see. Anonymous attendee. Is there such a thing as giving yourself too much grace or indulging in too much self-care when there is so much to be done?
Ooh, that's a good question. There are not too many limits in my mind, I think, to giving ourselves too much grace, but there's a line that automatically comes to mind for me, and it has to do with how we interact with and treat other people, which is and animals, anything like that. Sometimes people can treat other people poorly and then make excuses for themselves. So I would never want anything that I'm saying to be confused with that. I think if you're really struggling in your relationships, and this absolutely applies to some people out there, if you find yourself often having kind of fractious interactions with people, and if on some level that it partially has to do with you, and people usually do know at least a little bit that on some level it has to do with them, therapy is going to be really vital and really important, because our relationships are everything. And so we have to take care of our own side of the street with nurturing them and treating them well. As far as self-care is concerned, I would never want to, for anyone to confuse what I'm saying as an excuse to just completely check out, so Lord knows there are some people on this planet that could spend their whole life at a spa. And some of those people are really abusing their power and abusing their privilege by not periscoping up out of their little personal cubbyhole and paying attention to what's happening in the world, right? But generally speaking, we have to fill our own cups before we can help other people. It's like putting gas into a car if your car runs on gas, electricity if it does not. But, a car will not run on empty, whether it's gas or electricity that it runs on. It will not run if there is nothing in it to make it run. And I think that a lot of people these days are running on fumes. If they were to really be honest with themselves about the way that they're living and the way that they're giving, they're doing it from a state of depletion. So giving yourself permission to log off, to refuel, it's just vitally important, in my opinion. I think very few people are overdoing self-care. As overplayed as that phrase is, I think far more people are underdoing it. Far more people are giving until they bleed, and they're just totally depleted.
So talk to us, just to follow up on that, a little more on self-care. What are some ideas for self-care? If somebody is in a crisis, not that you're offering, specific therapy right now, but what are some ways that we can care for ourselves, maybe even build it into our routine that will keep us sharp, especially for folks in the trenches?
Oh, it's a really good question. The idea of sort of self-care in a crisis is I think if you're really in a crisis, you probably just need to reach out for support wherever you can. I don't think anyone should ever be in a crisis alone. But if it's not quite at crisis level, it can be so many things, and it just depends on what a person's interests are. So, for example, I know a lot of people who get a tremendous benefit from baking. They just find it to be extremely therapeutic. And, in an ideal world, you're not baking with CNN on in the background. It's like maybe baking to Enya. No, I'm kidding, but like put some music on, put a pot, put something on that maybe is going to make you laugh or something, whatever, do it in silence and bake. Or, some people really do benefit from getting like some type of spa service, whether it's, going and getting a pedicure, if you're the kind of person who likes that kind of thing, as silly as it sounds, just sometimes being touched and rubbed can make a person feel really good. I think things that involve other people, again, I'll repeat myself until the cows come home, but taking a walk in the woods, any degree of nature, and this can be really difficult for those among us who live nowhere near nature, really problematic for inner cities where trees have been removed. Don't get me started on that one, but I think if you can get to any natural setting, a body of water, a grove of trees, a place where you can take your shoes off and put them in grass, put your feet in the grass or something. There's actually a lot to be said for the therapeutic benefits of nature. And I would say that self-care is really just anything that makes you feel good. If going for a walk and putting your phone away for a little while just like helps you to get some fresh air and, well, then that's it. And like meditation for a lot of people is vital. Some people can't stand it. And if they can't, then that's fine. But, just even turning off all of our devices and taking a couple of deep breaths. I'll just state for the record that the magical number is 3. If you can take 3 deep breaths, you activate your parasympathetic nervous system. So that's a really good life hack for anyone who doesn't want to actually fully sit their butt down on a meditation cushion and do that kind of thing. But 3 deep breaths will go a long way. And it's just whatever makes you feel good.
I just got in 3 deep breaths while you were talking
Awesome.
about that. Just one quick note too. It's always baffled me that the people who perhaps need self-care the most are the people who can least afford it, in terms of folks working multiple jobs and not having the luxury of middle or upper class, like, professional jobs where you have a lot of flexibility, or access to resources so that you can get, wonderful self-care. And of course, journaling and meditation and nature tend to be pretty cheap.
Yep, cheap to free. And I was just going to say the same thing. It does not have to cost you any money.
Exactly.
It doesn't. I don't think we should confuse self-care with spending money.
Bingo. Oh, thank you for saying that. Barry Johnson said some very kind things. Always learn so much from the Red Project talks when I can attend. And today from Dr. Carr. Thank you, Barry. A couple of other questions. There are a lot of therapists and advice givers on social media that it's hard to know who is a trusted source. Do you have any recommendations for counselors and mental health experts to follow? And this feels like maybe a good segue for you to share your handles.
Yeah, and I don't share a ton of advice on social media, although if anybody wants to follow me, I'm at Dr. Leslie Carr, just Dr. Leslie Carr on Instagram and Twitter. There's someone called the Holistic Psychologist on Instagram who I think has a lot of really lovely advice. It's a little bit more self-care and advice oriented. So the Holistic Psychologist is one to follow. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I can think of offhand. No specific handles, but I will just say trust your gut. It's and important to check in with your gut. We can't trust our guts if we don't check in with it. But really notice if you come across somebody's account, is what you're seeing, reading, hearing Does it make you feel better? Does it make you feel worse? Are you finding that you feel shamed, like you're not trying hard enough? You got to follow the things that actually lift you up in life.
Okay. Thank you. Question from Larissa from Mexico. She's asking about the opportunities or access that women have to psychological care. Are they the same as the access that men have?
Oh man, that's such a good question. I think so. I can't think of any barriers that exist for women specifically that don't apply to men. It's funny because women tend to seek out mental health resources far more than men do. Especially one of the few areas of our lives where the imbalance is completely in the opposite direction. I think there probably are a lot of men that would benefit from mental health care and professional mental health care, and they don't get it, they don't seek it out, and it's a problem. It's a problem with toxic masculinity. It's a problem of masculinity, period. But no, I can't think of any affordability. Men sometimes have more money, so women may have a harder time accessing resources purely if they lack the funds to pay for it, whereas a man maybe would have the funds and not be using it.
Interesting dichotomy there. Another question, and then this one shifts gears to young folks. They ask, I've noticed that nearly all of the teenagers and college age people in my life are really struggling right now. I know everyone is, but it feels like they're having an extra hard time. Do you have any tips for supporting Gen Z or setting a good example for them?
Oh God, it's such a good question. I first want to just validate that by saying that the data would support the idea that this person is right. If you subjectively just ask baby boomers and then Gen X people how they feel about their own mental health and whether they're struggling, 7% of baby boomers will self-report that they struggle with their mental health in any capacity. And with Gen Z, the percentage is like 49%. It's just young people today are struggling a lot. And one of the reasons why they're struggling so much, I mean, there's a lot going on here because the planet is obviously really having a moment right now, but a lot of it actually has to do with their use of digital technology, because they spend a lot of time scrolling on their phones and they spend far less time in the company of other people. And sadly, as I was saying before, a lot of times when Gen Z, and based on what I'm hearing, it's even worse for Gen Alpha, which is the younger generation after Gen Z.
What age are they? Just for clarity, sorry.
For some reason, it just came through so loud. Gen Alpha, you're saying what's that?
Yeah, the age.
They are, let me think, I mean, they're basically today's teenagers and preteens. You know, Gen Z at this point is like they're mostly in their 20s, and Gen Alpha is preteen and teenagers. And that's the generation of people that, you know, basically have experienced a lot of their high school experience, in the pandemic and attached to their devices because of the pandemic, you know, home, going to school on Zoom and that kind of stuff. And as a result, they have a far greater tendency than anybody much older than them to get together with their peers and get together with other people, and they'll scroll on their phones together. And it's really tough. I really don't want to shame it or act like I'm judging it, because they're just doing, you know, we are all a product of the cultures of which we are a part, you know, like this is just the world that they have been raised in. But if I could wave a magic wand over the situation, I would get them, at least when they are together, to put down their phones and actually do something with each other. Play a board game. You know what? Taboo is an excellent board game. I laugh so hard when I play Taboo with my friends. If you are a teenager right now and you're watching this, buy a set of Taboo, put your phones away, and play a game with your friends. The rules are really simple. It makes people laugh really hard. Get together, make a meal, do something, put your phones away.
Well, it's so interesting you bring up this idea, right, of people individualizing problems. And we tend to think of oftentimes when we're struggling with mental health issues or feelings of depression, we end up thinking that we're suffering alone. We end up
Yeah.
thinking that it's something to do with us. And yet what we have done, and by we, I mean the adults in the room right now, we beta tested a new technology on an entire generation of human beings, and it's had measurably negative effects, some positive, but measurably negative effects on their well-being. And we are the cause of that. So I always ask, each generation, like, well, what did your parents and educators and policymakers and what did the adults in the room do to mess you up, right? And not mess you up in a way that's not retrieval, that can't be fixed. But it really is our fault, right? So we need to do something about this, and we're not really taking action along those lines. And I know that's a little off topic, but if we're going to look at the mental health, what is really harming young people, we have to look at what we're doing with social media consumption and how it is tapping what you're talking about, which is the core, which are our relationships, right? We know that all these happiness studies now tell us there's two things driving human happiness. One is relationships, and the other is service and doing meaningful work in the world, whether it's paid or unpaid. So if you take away half of that, you take away the relational component with new technology, of course it's going to have a profound effect on the happiness of humans.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it is interesting to think that for the youngest people among us today, and not that literally the youngest, because I'm not talking about infants, but for the young people who are coming up right now, it's not just that the planet is heating up. It's not just that we have a rogue Supreme Court that's stripping our rights away. It's the constant exposure to it. It's like the polar ice caps are melting and you're constantly aware of it because you're constantly on your phone. So that's a lot of what we see with young people now. Yeah.
And of course, I'm like, and the school shootings and the pandemic and Black Lives
I can't believe we haven't talked about guns yet. I mean, my God.
So I'm going to
take
3 deep breaths, go out in nature, connect with other human beings, give myself grace. Any closing words of advice as we end this interview, Dr. Leslie Carr?
No, I just would say, thank you so much for having me. And I wish everybody the best out there, to the extent that we all have, we're all fighting the good fight right now. Let's just fight it together.
Ah, yes. I wish I was there. Give you
I know, exactly. Help right now.
And Tracy has asked if this recording will be available. It absolutely will be, with some resources for various marginalized groups and general resources for mental health. Be safe, be healthy, be as happy as you can, and fight the good fight, folks. It's just wonderful that you joined us today, and we will see you again soon for another Power Hour. Thank you, Dr. Leslie Carr, for your wisdom today. And I know I am inspired and have a little more armor on and ready to do the battle.
Great. So good to be here today. Thank you.